The Spook House by Ambrose Bierce. On the road leading north of Manchester in eastern Kentucky to Boonville, 20 miles away, stood, in 1862, a wooden plantation house of a somewhat better quality than most dwellings in the region. The house was destroyed by a fire in the year following, probably by some stragglers from the retreating column of George W. Morgan when he was driven from Cumberland Gap to the Ohio River by General Kirby Smith. At the time of its destruction, it had 4 or 5 years been vacant. The fields about it were overgrown with brambles, the fences gone, and even the slaves' quarters and outhouses generally fallen partially into ruin by neglect and pillage. For the slaves and the poor whites of the vicinity found in the building and fences an abundant supply of fuel, for which they availed themselves without hesitation, openly and by daylight. By daylight alone. After nightfall, no human being except passing strangers ever went near the place. It was known as the Spook House, that it was tenanted by evil spirits, visible, audible, and active. No one in all that region doubted any more than he doubted what he was told of Sundays by the traveling preacher. Its owner's opinion of the matter was unknown. He and his family had disappeared one night, and no trace of them had ever been found. They left everything: household goods, clothing, provisions, the horses in the stable, the cows in the field, and the slaves in their quarter. All as it stood. Nothing was missing, except a man, a woman, 3 girls, a boy, and a babe. It was not altogether surprising that a plantation where 7 human beings could simultaneously be effaced, and nobody the wiser, should be under some suspicion. One night, in June 1859, 2 citizens of Frankfort, Colonel J.C. McArndale, a lawyer, and Judge Myron Vey of the state militia were driving from Boonville to Manchester. Their business was so important that they decided to push on, despite the darkness and the mutterings of an approaching storm, which eventually broke upon them just as they arrived opposite the Spook House. The lightning was so incessant that they easily found their way through the gate and into a shed, where they hitched and unharnessed their team. They then went to the house, through the rain, and knocked at all the doors without getting any response. Attributing this to the continuous uproar of the thunder, they pushed at one of the doors, which yielded. They then entered without further ceremony and closed the door. That instant they were in darkness and silence. Not a gleam of the lightning's unceasing blaze penetrated the windows or crevices. Not a whisper of the awful tumult without reached them there. It was as if they had been suddenly stricken blind and deaf. And McArndale afterwards said that for a moment he believed himself to have been killed by a stroke of lightning as he crossed the threshold. The rest of this adventure can be well related in his own words from the Frankfort Advocate of August 6th, 1876. When I had somewhat recovered from the dazing effect of the transition from uproar to silence, my first impulse was to reopen the door which I had closed, and from the knob of which I was not conscious of having removed from my hand, I felt it distinctly still in the clasp of my fingers. My notion was to ascertain by stepping outside into the storm whether or not I had been deprived of sight and hearing. I turned the knob and pulled open the door, and it led into another room. This apartment was suffused with a faint greenish light, and the sorts of which I could not determine, making everything distinctly visible, though nothing was sharply defined. Everything, everything, I say, but in truth, the only object within the blank stone walls of that room were human corpses. In the number, they were perhaps 8 or 10. It may well be understood that I did not truly count them, They were of different ages, or rather sizes, from infancy up, and of both sexes. They were all prostrate on the floor except for one, apparently a young woman, who sat up, her back supported by an angle of the wall. A babe was clasped in the arms of another, an older woman. A half-grown lad lay face down across the legs of a fully bearded man. One or two were nearly naked, and the hand of the girl held a fragment of the gown from which she had torn open at the breast. The bodies were in various stages of decay, all greatly shrunken in the face and in figure. Some were but little more than skeletons. While I stood stupefied with horror by this ghastly spectacle, and still holding open the door, by some unaccountable perversity, my attention was diverted from the shocking scene and concerned itself with the trifles and details. Perhaps my mind, with an instinct of self-preservation, sought relief in the matter, which would relax its dangerous tension. I observed that the door that I was holding was of heavy iron plates riveted together, equidistant from one another, and from the top and bottom 3 strong bolts protruded from the beveled edges. I turned the knob, and they were retracted flush with the edge. I released it, and they shot out. It was a spring lock. On the inside there was no knob nor any kind of projection, a smooth iron surface. While noting these things with an interest and attention which now astonishes me to recall, I felt myself thrust aside, and Judge Vey, whom in the intensity and vicissitudes of my feelings I had forgotten altogether, pushed by me into the room. "For God's sake," I cried, "do not go in there. Let us get out of this dreadful place." He gave no heed to my entreaties, but, as fearless a gentleman as lived in all of the South, walked quickly to the center of the room, knelt beside one of the bodies for a closer examination, and tenderly raised its blackened and shriveled head in his hands. A strong, disagreeable odor came through the doorway, completely overpowering me. My senses reeled, and I felt myself falling. I clutched at the edge of the door for support and pushed it shut with a sharp click. I remember no more. 6 weeks later, I recovered my reason in a hotel in Manchester, whither I had been taken by strangers the next day. For all these weeks, I had suffered from a nervous fever, attended with constant delirium. I had been found lying in the road several miles away from the house, but how I had escaped from it to get there I never knew. On recovery, or as soon as my physician permitted me to talk, I inquired of the fate of Judge Vey, whom, quiet to me, and now I know, they represented as well and at home. No one believed a word of my story, and who can wonder? And who can imagine my grief when, arriving at home in Frankfurt 2 months later, I learned that Judge Vey had never been heard of since that night. I then regretted bitterly the pride which, since the first few days after the recovery of my reason, had forbidden me to repeat my discredited story and insist upon its truth. With all that afterwards occurred, the examination of the house, the failure to find any room corresponding to that which I have described, and the attempt to have me adjudged insane, and my triumph over my accusers, which the readers of the Advocate are familiar, after all these years, I'm still confident that the excavations, which I have neither the legal right to undertake nor the wealth to make, would disclose the secret of the disappearance of my unhappy friend, and possibly of the former occupants and owners of the deserted and now destroyed house. I do not despair of yet bringing about such a search, and it is a source of deep grief to me that it has been delayed by the undeserved hostility and otherwise incredulity of the family and friends of the late Judge Vey. Colonel McArndale died in Frankfurt on the 13th day of December in the year 1879. Thus is the end of the tale of the Spook House.